Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Space Channel. The designs most likely to survive a 2,000-year crossing are the ones nobody would want to live inside. That is the uncomfortable center of this subject. A sealed society cannot exile anyone, cannot afford to imprison anyone, cannot let its population grow past a fixed ceiling, and cannot rely on the consent of anyone born after departure. Each of those constraints has an answer, and most of the available answers are coercive. Tonight we work through the whole ledger: legitimacy, government, law, the archive, demography, conflict, meaning, and collapse, and find out what surviving 2,000 years inside would actually cost. If you find these explorations worth your time, a like or a subscribe helps the channel reach others who do. Thank you for being here. But for the next 2 hours, none of this is something you need to carry. No decision here belongs to you. Nothing tonight is asking anything of you at all. Settle in and let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow. Let the day fade away. Let's begin. Part 1. The length of the thing. A generation ship is almost always described by its engine. The propulsion is the part that photographs well, and the part that can be calculated. But the engine is not the difficult component. The difficult component is the group of people inside, and the question of whether they will still be a group when the ship arrives. There are 3 separate questions that can be asked about a crossing like this. The first is whether the machine lasts. The second is whether the biology lasts. The third is whether the society lasts, and it is the only one of the 3 with no engineering answer. A society is not a component. It cannot be specified on a drawing, tested to destruction in a laboratory, or replaced from stores when it fails. Tonight we ask only that third question, and we ask it at a length long enough to make it honest. 2,000 years. That number deserves a moment of arithmetic, because large numbers tend to arrive as adjectives rather than quantities. At 25 to 30 years per generation, 2,000 years is somewhere between 67 and 80 generations. Roughly 70 is the working figure. Of those 70, 1 generation departs, and 1 generation arrives. 68 live and die entirely in transit, without ever seeing either end. Measured backward from now, 2,000 years lands in the early Roman imperial period. Everything that has happened since fits inside the span the ship has to cross, without losing continuity. Every language shift, every collapse and recovery, every founding and refounding of every institution currently standing on Earth. All of it fits inside the crossing, with room left over. The speed required is modest, which is the part that surprises people. The nearest star system lies a little over 4 light-years away. Covering that distance in 2,000 years requires about 1/5 of 1% of the speed of light, which works out to roughly 630 kilometers per second. 12 light-years, which reaches several genuinely interesting stars, requires about 6/10 of 1%. 20 light-years requires about 1%. That last figure reframes the whole subject, and it is worth sitting with. 2,000 years is not a pessimistic number. It is the number that buys a choice of destination. A 400-year crossing forces the founders to take the nearest star whether or not it turns out to be any good. A 2,000-year crossing puts something on the order of 100 stellar systems within reach and lets them pick. The extra 16 centuries are not a penalty. They are a shopping trip. Against real hardware, 600 kilometers per second is roughly 37 times the speed at which our outbound probes are currently leaving the solar system. It is around 3 times the peak speed of the fastest object humans have ever accelerated, and that object only reaches its peak briefly, by falling toward the sun. So the speed is not trivial, but it is the kind of number engineers argue about rather than the kind they dismiss. Against demonstrated durability, the comparison is less comfortable. The longest any spacecraft has operated is around 50 years, and those decades have been a slow accumulation of losses and workarounds. 2,000 years is 40 times that. Nothing aboard can be stocked as a spare, because 40 replacements of every component is not a supply problem, it is a manufacturing requirement. Everything the ship contains, it must eventually make. And still the hardware is the easy half. Consider how the two kinds of failure differ. A machine fails by wearing out. The bearing seizes, the seal hardens, the circuit opens, and somewhere a light changes color. A society fails in a completely different manner. It fails by forgetting what it was for, or by deciding, gradually and reasonably, that it was for something else. Both of these are failures. Only one of them leaves the hull intact, the lights on, and everybody aboard perfectly content. That asymmetry is what makes the social question the hard one. Every hardware failure is visible, measurable, and has an owner. Somebody is responsible for that valve. Institutional failure has none of those properties. It is invisible from the inside, it triggers no alarm, and it is generally experienced by the people living through it as ordinary life. Which means the realistic failure mode is not mutiny. Mutiny is an event, and events get recorded, argued about, and resisted. The realistic failure mode is drift. A slow reallocation of attention, of budget, of the best people, away from a purpose that nobody has formally abandoned and nobody is actively defending. Picture the founder's documents, 2,000 years on. Still aboard. Still legible, in the narrow sense that the marks survive and can be decoded by a trained reader. Nobody has destroyed them. Nobody has forbidden them. They have simply become, by generation 50, a specialist interest. It helps to know what the terrestrial record says about institutions that last, because the record is thinner than we might hope. A small number of human institutions have held a continuous identity for 1,000 years or more. Certain religious orders. A handful of universities founded in the 11th and 12th centuries. A few national assemblies, most of them with interruptions in the record. Almost none of them have held a continuous operational task. That distinction matters enormously. Holding an identity means still being recognizably the same body. Holding an operational task means there is a specific job that still has to be performed correctly, on a specific future date, by whoever happens to be there. The institutions that survive longest survive by transmitting identity and practice. They do not survive by transmitting a project plan. The oldest continuously operating commercial enterprise on record lasted roughly 14 centuries before being absorbed into a larger firm. Its continuity depended on a continuously renewed external demand for its work, not on an internal promise made to founders long dead. There was always someone outside asking for what it made. The ship has no outside. So the design conclusion is uncomfortable and important. If a task must survive 70 generations, it probably cannot be encoded as a schedule. It has to be encoded as identity and ritual. That is a claim about culture engineering. And culture engineering is not a field with a track record. It is barely a field at all. Before going further, it is worth naming the 4 ways a shipboard society can fail, because everything that follows is a defense against one or more of them. The first is dissolution. The society stops being one society. Factions form that no longer cooperate, and the hull contains two populations instead of one. The second is drift. The society persists, but the mission does not. The ship stops being a vehicle and becomes a destination in its own right, and the crossing continues by inertia rather than by intent. The third is decay of competence. The society persists, still wants the mission, and can no longer perform the work. The archive is intact and the skills are gone. The fourth is tyranny. The society persists, holds the mission, and can do the work, but only at the cost of a life nobody would have chosen. This fourth failure almost never appears in the technical literature, and it is the one that decides whether the answer to tonight's question is acceptable rather than merely possible. Hold on to that fourth one, because it changes how everything else reads. A ship can arrive perfectly, on schedule, with a healthy population and a working reactor, and still represent a 2,000-year moral catastrophe. Every requirement we work through has to be read twice. Once for whether it works, and once for what it costs the person living underneath it. There is one more number to set before we begin, and it sets everything else. Genetic minimum crew estimates for multi-generational crossings span 2 orders of magnitude, and the spread is not a scientific disagreement. Under strictly managed reproduction, with assigned pairings, controlled numbers of children, and active avoidance of relatedness, simulation work finds that on the order of 100 founders can produce a genetically healthy arriving population even across a crossing of several thousand years. Under free reproductive choice, and a requirement that the crew carry a representative sample of human variation rather than merely a viable one, the figure rises into the thousands, and in the strictest treatments into the tens of thousands. The same work identifies which lever matters most, and it is not the engine. Controlling the number of children per woman across many consecutive generations is the single parameter that most reliably prevents the population from drifting toward extinction. Demography, not thrust, decides whether anyone arrives at all, which means the society begins with a constitutional question about bodies. Every section that follows inherits it. Part 2. Consent that cannot be given. The first requirement sits underneath all the others, and it is not a piece of hardware. The ship must find something to stand on where consent would normally be. The founding cohort volunteers. That is the last time anyone aboard will. The second generation is the first to be governed without having agreed to be, and by generation 70, the founders are as distant from the living as the early Roman emperors are from us. Everyone in between inherits a life chosen by people they have only seen in recordings. This is not in itself a new problem. Nobody consents to being born into a country either. Nationality arrives before the capacity to accept it, and every terrestrial society is built on people who were simply handed their circumstances. So the objection cannot be that non-consensual membership is unprecedented. It is entirely ordinary. What is not ordinary is the missing valve. Every terrestrial society has, in principle, an exit. Emigration is the mechanism that makes inherited membership tolerable, and the reason it works is subtler than it looks. Most people never leave. The value of the exit is not that it gets used. The value is that its existence converts a captivity into a choice. A citizen can accept a state they never selected because leaving is conceivable, even when it is difficult, even when it is expensive, even when they will never actually do it. A sealed ship has no exit. It is the first human society in which leave, if you do not like it, is not merely hard, but physically undefined. There is no direction in which the sentence points. That single fact changes the character of every institution aboard, and it is the reason a generation ship cannot simply import a terrestrial constitution and expect it to behave the same way. There is a second asymmetry, and it sits at the other end of the problem. Informed consent requires knowing what one is consenting to, and the founders cannot know. They are agreeing, on behalf of 70 generations, to conditions no human has experienced and no model can fully predict. They are not merely choosing for their descendants. They are choosing for their descendants under uncertainty they cannot resolve, about a life they cannot imagine accurately. So legitimacy has to rest on something other than agreement. There are 4 candidates, and each one has a different durability and a different price. The first is performance. The government is legitimate because the ship works and life aboard is good. This is the most intuitive option and the most fragile. It means legitimacy is only ever as strong as the last decade of maintenance results. A crop failure, a hull breach, a cascade of equipment losses, and the state is delegitimized at precisely the moment it most needs authority. Performance-based legitimacy is a promise that the ship will never have a bad century, which is not a promise anyone can keep. The second is participation. The government is legitimate because everyone genuinely has a voice. This is attractive, and it is expensive in a way that is easy to underestimate. Real participation at scale requires functioning institutions, informed citizens, time deliberately set aside from productive work, and honest access to information about the ship's actual state. All of that has to hold for 70 consecutive generations, without a single lapse long enough to become a precedent. Participation is not a value the founders can install. It is a habit that has to be reformed continuously, by every cohort, forever. The third is inheritance. The government is legitimate because this is simply who we are, and this is how we have always done things. This one is remarkably stable and brittle in an unusual way. It works perfectly, for centuries, until somebody asks the question directly. And when the question is finally asked out loud, inheritance has no answer to give. It was never an argument. It was the absence of one. The fourth is belief. The government is legitimate because the mission is sacred. On the terrestrial evidence, this is, by a considerable margin, the most durable option across 2,000-year spans. It is also the most dangerous, and the reason is straightforward. A belief strong enough to hold a ship together for 2,000 years is a belief strong enough to justify anything done in its name. Durability and restraint are not the same property, and the mechanism that supplies the first does not supply the second. Which brings us to the central tension of the whole subject, and it is worth stating plainly because it will recur in every section that follows. The designs most likely to survive 2,000 years are the ones we would least want to live inside. Durability and decency pull in opposite directions. Most of what follows is a search for the places where they can be made to agree. There is one reframing that helps, and it comes from the ethics of long-duration missions rather than from the engineering. Because consent cannot be obtained, a different obligation is substituted in its place. If the founders cannot ask their descendants what they want, then what they owe them is the widest possible set of options. Design for reversibility. Design for choice. Do not design for optimality, because optimality is a guess about the preferences of people who do not exist yet. That is a genuinely different founding task. It is not make the right decision. It is leave the largest number of decisions still open. In one sense, that is a lower bar, because it excuses the founders from predicting the future. In another sense, it is far more expensive, because openness is bought with mass, and mass is the one thing an interstellar mission cannot spend freely. Openness takes concrete forms, and they are worth listing because they are the actual deliverables of this requirement. Spare volume with no assigned function. Unallocated mass and power budget held in reserve for purposes nobody has thought of. A governing charter with a genuine amendment procedure rather than a sealed one. More than one workable method for every essential job so that no technique becomes the only technique. And habitable buffer space large enough that a group of people can put real distance between themselves and the rest of the population without leaving. The Charter itself presents a smaller version of the same problem. The more specific a founding document is, the sooner it becomes obsolete, because specificity is a bet on conditions that will change. The more general it is, the less it actually constrains anyone. The known compromise is a short entrenched core, surrounded by a large amendable body, so that the parts most likely to age are the parts easiest to revise. And a charter written for readers 70 generations away faces the same difficulty as any other very old document, which means the Constitution is not only a legal instrument, it is an archival artifact, and it will need the same care. There is also a duty running in the other direction, toward the far end rather than the near one. The founders cannot consult the arriving generation either. Those people inherit both the culture of the ship and the obligation to bring it down onto a surface, and they have no more say in the matter than anyone in the middle. Consent is missing at both ends of the crossing, not just at the beginning. That last item recurs so often in this subject that it has a name. It is called the exit substitute, and the strongest form of it is internal partition. Two or more habitats that can become socially independent while remaining mechanically joined. Partition costs mass. It doubles several redundancy requirements. It complicates every shared system, every loop, every corridor. And it buys the one thing a sealed society otherwise cannot have, which is the ability to disagree by walking away. Imagine that as a piece of architecture. A corridor with a door in it that has never been closed. It is inspected, lubricated, and tested by people who hope it never will be, because the day it closes is the day the ship becomes two ships. The door is not a failure mode. It is a constitutional provision expressed in metal. There is a harder version of the same principle, and it applies to dissent itself. A ship that permits genuine disagreement must be able to survive that disagreement being correct. If a faction argues that the mission should be abandoned and turns out to have the better argument, the institutions have to be capable of accepting it. A society that can only tolerate dissent it knows to be wrong has not solved the consent problem. It has merely postponed it. And there is a quieter irony at the founding end that deserves naming. The personality traits that make someone likely to volunteer for a one-way voyage are not obviously the traits that make a good founder of a multi-generational institution. Volunteering for a permanent departure selects for a certain restlessness, a certain willingness to sever. Building something meant to be inherited unchanged for 70 generations calls for something closer to the opposite. The people most eager to go may be the least suited to writing the rules for those who cannot. Part 3. Government that outlives its founders. The second requirement is a structure of authority that survives 70 successions without either ossifying into something rigid or dissolving into something that cannot act. Begin with the awkward fact about written constitutions. On Earth, their median working life is measured in decades. Most national constitutions are replaced within a single human lifetime, and the ones that endure do so by being amended, repeatedly and substantially, until the document a country lives under bears only a family resemblance to the one it started with. Longevity in constitutional law is not a property of stone. It is a property of flexibility. So the ship's charter must be amendable. But the mission cannot be, or drift becomes lawful. That is a genuine structural contradiction, and it deserves to be stated as one. A document that can change everything except one thing has to protect that one thing against 70 generations of people who are explicitly permitted to change everything else. The exception is the weak point, and the people testing it will have centuries. 4 mechanisms exist for holding an exception like that, and they are worth weighing individually. The first is entrenchment. A clause is declared unamendable, placed beyond the reach of any future vote. This works beautifully on paper and has a poor record in practice, for a reason that is almost tautological. A population determined enough to change an unamendable clause is a population determined enough to ignore it. Entrenchment does not create a barrier. It creates a formality that a sufficiently motivated majority steps over. The second is dispersal. Mission authority is deliberately split across several bodies so that no single institution can revoke it alone. This is robust against capture because there is no single office to seize. It is vulnerable to paralysis because the same structure that prevents one body from abandoning the mission prevents anybody from acting decisively on its behalf. The third is ritualization. The mission is encoded as a practice that everyone participates in annually, so that abandoning it means abolishing a holiday rather than repealing a law. This has by far the best terrestrial track record of the 4, and by a wide margin. Practices outlive arguments. A ceremony that a population has performed every year for 600 years is not a policy anyone can quietly discontinue, because discontinuing it would be noticed by every person aboard on the day it did not happen. The fourth is physical constraint. Build a ship that cannot turn around and cannot stop itself, so that the mission is a fact rather than a policy. That fourth answer is the strongest and the most brutal in the entire subject, and it is worth slowing down for. The strategy is not to preserve intent for 2,000 years. The strategy is to make intent unnecessary. If the ship physically cannot reverse, then mission drift becomes harmless. The society may forget the mission entirely. It may actively disbelieve in the destination. It may regard the founders as a curiosity or a mistake. And it will still arrive. Several serious treatments of very long crossings converge on exactly this design, and there is something clarifying about it. It solves a governance problem by removing the government's ability to matter. Nothing anyone decides can affect the outcome, which means nothing anyone forgets can affect it either. The limit of that answer arrives at the far end. Braking still has to happen. Deceleration is the one irreversible task that cannot be made fully automatic without accepting enormous risk, and the generation required to perform it is the one furthest in time from the founders, with the least cultural connection to the purpose and no practical experience of anything resembling the maneuver. So physical constraint converts a 2,000-year continuity problem into a single-generation competence problem at the end. That is a real improvement. It is not a solution. Underneath all 4 mechanisms sits a planar difficulty, which is succession. Institutional continuity is mostly a succession problem. The interesting question is never who holds authority. It is what happens when the person holding it stops, and on this ship that question comes up, at minimum 70 times. Scale changes the character of the answer completely. A population of a few hundred to a few thousand has the numbers of a village, not a nation. Village-scale politics is intensely personal, in a way that national politics is not. Everyone is related to, indebted to, or in a long-running dispute with everyone. There is no anonymity, no fresh start, and no strangers. Every appointment is also a family matter, and every grievance has a history that predates the people carrying it. Term limits acquire an odd meaning in that setting. Rotation of office is a healthy principle when the pool of candidates is large. In a population where the qualified successors for a critical technical office number perhaps 5, rotation and depth of expertise are in direct conflict. The ship can have fresh leadership or experienced leadership. Arranging for both requires deliberately training more specialists than the work requires, which is a standing cost, paid forever, against a risk that only occasionally materializes. Nepotism, in this environment, is not primarily a moral failing. It is the default output of apprenticeship-based training. Any office learned by working alongside the person who holds it will tend to pass through families, because families are who work alongside each other. Preventing that requires an active institutional intervention maintained across centuries, and the intervention will feel arbitrary to every generation that inherits it. There is a specific channel through which authority concentrates, and it is worth naming because it is not sinister. It is emergency powers. A genuine crisis justifies concentrated decision-making, because committees are slow and a depressurization is not. And concentrated authority, once granted, rarely returns itself voluntarily. Over 70 generations, a ship will have dozens of genuine crises, each one a legitimate occasion for exactly this concentration. The danger is not any single emergency, it is the ratchet. The founding generation holds one advantage, that no later cohort will, and it is worth spending deliberately. They are the only people aboard with direct experience of an alternative society. That makes them the only cohort capable of noticing that something has gone wrong by outside standards rather than by internal ones. Everything they consider obvious about how people should be treated is knowledge that becomes unavailable the moment they die, unless it is written down while it still feels too obvious to bother writing. A ship may also need an office whose entire function is remembering. Not deciding, but knowing what was decided before and why, and being able to say so out loud when a proposal resembles something that already failed. Separating institutional memory from institutional authority means the record can contradict the government without threatening it. And there is a structural oddity in every long-horizon vote taken aboard. Any decision whose payoff lies beyond a lifetime is made by people with no personal stake in the outcome. That is either a description of statesmanship or a description of irresponsibility, and which one it becomes is a matter of culture rather than procedure. Which brings us to the least glamorous and most load-bearing part of this section. Legitimacy across centuries depends on precedent, and precedent depends on records that both survive and remain interpretable. A society that loses its archive loses its constitution even when the physical document persists, because what it has actually lost is the accumulated body of interpretation that told everyone what the words meant in practice. The text, without the case history, is a set of slogans. Written procedure is therefore a preservation technology. It is the mechanism by which an institution remembers something it learned before anyone currently alive was born. The unglamorous conclusion is that a generation ship's most important cultural artifact may well be its filing system, and that the people maintaining it are doing constitutional work, whether or not anyone describes it that way. There is one more structural problem, and it has no terrestrial parallel. Corruption in a closed system has no external check. There is no press from elsewhere. There is no other jurisdiction to flee to, no higher court to appeal to, and no comparison case to measure against. Every safeguard must be internal, and every safeguard must be maintained by people who have never once seen an uncorrupted example of anything. The available answer is transparency by design. Full, continuous instrumentation of the ship's physical state, publicly readable by anyone aboard, so that any claim about competence or resource use can be independently checked by the person affected by it. Oxygen production, water recovery, crop yield, power margin, radiator load. Every number visible, always, to everyone. That turns the ship's telemetry into a constitutional organ. It is the closest thing a sealed society can have to an objective outside observer, because the instruments do not care who is in office. A government can argue about interpretations. It cannot argue with a reservoir level that everybody can read. And there is a final mechanism, occasionally proposed and rarely examined, which addresses the consent problem from the previous section directly. A formal, scheduled review, in which each generation must publicly re-ratify or amend the Charter. Not a vote on whether to continue the crossing, which physical constraint has already settled, but a vote on the terms of the life aboard. It converts inherited legitimacy into periodically renewed legitimacy. It gives every cohort an occasion on which the question is not merely permitted, but required. And it accepts, in advance, that the answer might change. Part 4. Law without elsewhere. The third requirement is a justice system that still functions when there is nowhere to send anyone. Every human system of justice leans, somewhere in its foundations, on the existence of somewhere else. Exile is the oldest form of it. Transportation to a distant colony was the industrial version. Imprisonment is a place apart, constructed deliberately because no natural elsewhere was available. And underneath all of the formal mechanisms sits the informal one that most people actually use, which is simply the ability of an injured party to move to another town and stop encountering the person who wronged them. A sealed ship removes all of it at once. The available responses to serious wrongdoing reduce to 5: death, confinement inside the same air and water loop, loss of privilege, loss of reproductive license, and reintegration. That is the entire menu, and 2 of the 5 are unaffordable on arithmetic alone. Execution fails first. In a population of a few hundred, every person is a measurable fraction of the gene pool and a measurable fraction of the total skill base. Removing one person removes a percent-scale share of the society's accumulated competence, permanently, along with everything that person would have taught to someone else across the remaining decades of their working life. A ship cannot execute anyone for the same reason a village with one blacksmith cannot execute the blacksmith. The cost lands on everybody, forever, and it compounds. Imprisonment fails for that reason and a second one. A prisoner still breathes roughly 0.8 of a kilogram of oxygen a day and exhales roughly a kilogram of carbon dioxide. A prisoner drinks from the same loop, eats crops grown in the same scarce area, and radiates around 100 watts of metabolic heat that the ship must reject to vacuum through the same finite radiators. The life support cost of a prisoner is identical to the cost of a productive person. Only the output differs, which produces one of the few genuinely clean conclusions in this whole subject. Restorative justice on a generation ship is not an ethical preference or a progressive experiment. It is what is left over after subtracting every option the ship cannot physically afford. The system has to return offenders to productive membership because there is no other outcome the vehicle can sustain. This is one of the rare places where the brutal constraint produces the humane answer. It does not produce it everywhere. The hard case is the person who genuinely cannot be safely reintegrated, and the options there collapse quickly. Permanent supervision is possible, and it consumes the scarcest resource aboard, which is not air or water, but trained human attention. Permanent medical management is possible, and it is ethically catastrophic, and it establishes a precedent no society should hold for 70 generations. Partition into a separate volume is possible, and it is the exit substitute again, in its darkest form. There is no clean answer there, and it would be dishonest to manufacture one. The honest statement is that a sealed society must decide in advance what it will do with a person it cannot fix, and that every available answer is worse than the answers available on Earth. That decision is made by the founders, on paper, decades before the first person aboard makes it necessary. Two of the remaining options deserve a closer look, because both are technically available and both carry problems the menu conceals. Loss of reproductive license appears on the list because in a society that already allocates permission to have children, withdrawing that permission is an obvious lever. It is also the point at which the demographic system becomes a penal instrument, and once those two functions are joined, they are very difficult to separate again. A society that punishes through reproduction has made every birth a matter of good conduct. It is worth naming and then setting down carefully. Restitution is the gentler option and has its own trap. In an economy without money, restitution takes the form of labor owed, which converts justice into a scheduling problem. Someone assigns the hours. Someone supervises them. And a system of assigned unpaid labor, maintained across centuries, drifts toward indenture without anyone choosing indenture, because each individual sentence looks entirely reasonable. There is also the question of who judges. In a population where everyone knows the defendant and is probably related to them, impartiality cannot be found demographically. It has to be constructed procedurally, through rules about disclosure, recusal, and the composition of panels, in the full knowledge that no panel will ever be genuinely disinterested. The closest terrestrial analogue is a small isolated settlement in winter, where the magistrate is also the neighbor, and everyone involved understands that the proceeding is a performance of fairness rather than an achievement of it. Meanwhile, the informal system will be doing most of the work, and it will be doing it harder than the formal one. With no anonymity, deterrence is extremely high and privacy is extremely low. Small community discipline is enforced primarily by reputation, and reputation is effective and merciless in equal measure. A reputation that follows a person for 80 years with no possibility of relocation is in practice a heavier sentence than most penalties a court could impose. Informal punishment in a sealed community can exceed the formal system in severity without ever being reviewed by it, and without anyone having decided to impose it. The countermeasure is architectural, which is a strange thing to say about a legal problem. Interior walls built for visual and acoustic separation rather than for weather. Sanctuary volumes where a person cannot be pursued, argued with, or assigned work. The right to be unobserved, designed in as a feature rather than left to the accident of available space. On a ship, privacy is not a luxury that emerges when there is room to spare. It has to be built, deliberately, in a place where every square meter has a competing claim on it. It is worth asking what the confinement research actually shows, because the evidence base is thinner and stranger than the topic deserves. The longest high-fidelity study of a crewed interplanetary transit sealed 6 crew members inside a ground facility for 520 days. Averaged across the crew, the results were reassuring. Sufficient sleep. High vigilance performance. No indication of depression. Low psychological distress. High self-reported happiness, health, and energy. On the numbers, it went well. Two findings from that work matter far more than the averages. The first is that there were substantial differences between individuals in how they responded to prolonged confinement. The second is that adaptation proceeded in stages, including a recognizable mid-mission trough consistent with the pattern observed in other isolated crews, where morale dips in the third quarter of a fixed-duration mission rather than at its hardest point. The lesson for a 2,000-year design is precise, and it inverts how the result is usually reported. The average is fine. The variance is the problem. A ship must be built for its worst adapted members rather than its median ones, because the median member is not the one who breaks something. Long isolation crews across many settings report the same dominant difficulty, and it is not violence or breakdown. It is the simple impossibility of avoiding a person you dislike. Interpersonal friction, not clinical illness, is the main channel through which small sealed groups degrade. Nothing dramatic happens. People simply run out of ways to get away from each other. And here is the hardest structural point in this section. Selection cannot help beyond Generation Zero. The founders can be screened for psychological resilience, compatibility, stability, and tolerance of confinement. Their children cannot be. By the second generation, the population is simply a population, carrying the ordinary human distribution of temperament, illness, grievance, and difficulty. Every result from every confinement study describes screened volunteers on a short mission with a known end date and a return ticket. Nobody has ever studied the population a generation ship is actually made of, and nobody can. Which sets the infrastructure requirement. The ship carries not merely a hospital, but a permanent, continuously staffed psychiatric and social work capability, maintained for 70 generations. That includes the generations in which nobody alive has ever met a patient with the condition described in the manual they are reading, and must recognize it anyway, from a description written by someone 2,000 years dead. Two smaller mechanisms are worth naming, because both address the inheritance of grievance. The first is the statute of limitations, which in a sealed society becomes a question about institutional forgetting. At what point does the ship formally stop counting an offense, and who has standing to insist that it should keep counting? The second is amnesty, as a scheduled institution rather than a response to a particular crisis. A deliberate calendared forgetting, performed at intervals precisely to prevent the accumulation of inherited feuds across 70 generations of people who cannot separate. And legal continuity is the archive problem in a different costume. Precedent lives in records. A society that loses its case history reverts to arbitrary judgment by whoever is currently respected, which is where every legal system began and where none of them wishes to return. Part 5. The archive problem. The fourth requirement is a way of carrying knowledge across 2,000 years that does not depend on any single object surviving 2,000 years. There are three problems here, and they are usually discussed as one, which is why the subject stays confused. The first is the medium. Does the physical substrate survive? The second is the reader. Does a machine still exist that can interpret it? The third is the context. Does anyone still know what the data means? These three have completely different difficulties, and they get harder in that order. The medium problem is close to solved, and that is genuinely good news. Inscribed quartz glass and metal-based photographic media have projected lifetimes in the tens of thousands of years, without requiring energy-intensive storage conditions. Terrestrial deep archive projects already write data onto such media and place it in geologically stable vaults, hundreds of meters underground, in permafrost and in old mine workings, on the assumption that nobody will maintain them. For contrast, the media that most information currently lives on are dramatically worse. Optical discs are estimated to last up to about a century under ideal storage conditions, and considerably less than that under ordinary ones. Magnetic tape and writable optical media have working lifetimes measured in decades. Meanwhile, documents written on parchment and papyrus 2 millennia ago remain readable by eye, having been stored by nobody in a cave. That comparison is the single most useful fact in this section, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The oldest readable human documents outlast the newest storage technology by a factor of 20, and the gap has been widening rather than closing for the entire history of computing. Every advance in density has cost durability. A ship built with contemporary instincts about information would carry an archive with a shelf life shorter than a single generation aboard. The reader problem is where the difficulty starts to bite. Every digital format requires a machine and a software stack to interpret it, and on a ship that entire chain has to be reproducible from onboard materials for 2,000 years. Not the archive. The archive is easy. The reader, the fabrication capability behind the reader, and the knowledge required to operate both. Which means a format that can only be read using a fabricated microchip is, in practice, a format with a 50-year life. A semiconductor industry is the least likely thing aboard to survive uninterrupted, because it is the deepest technology stack the ship carries, and the one with the least tolerance for improvisation. Any archive whose accessibility depends on the ship's most fragile industry is not an archive. It is a hostage. The favored answer is a layered archive, and the layers are chosen by what they survive. An eye-readable layer, text and diagrams physically inscribed at a size legible with light and simple magnification and nothing else. A mechanically readable layer, information encoded in forms, a basic machine shop can decode without electronics. And an electronic layer, which carries the overwhelming bulk of the data and is understood from the beginning to be the layer that will be lost first. The eye-readable layer is the one that survives a dark age. It is also the layer that gets cut first from any mass budget, because it is enormously less efficient per kilogram than anything else aboard. It is the archive's insurance policy, and insurance is always the first thing that looks like waste to somebody trying to save mass. Then there is the context problem, which is unsolved and probably unsolvable. Data means nothing without the conventions, units, vocabulary, and tacit assumptions of the people who wrote it. Those drift, and no storage technology prevents drift, because drift happens in the readers rather than in the record. The arithmetic of language change is easy to state and hard to sit with. Written English of 4 centuries ago is readable with footnotes. Written English of 10 centuries ago is a foreign language requiring formal translation. 2,000 years of linguistic evolution is not an editing problem. It is a translation problem, and the ship must be its own translator, continuously, forever, with no external reference community to check itself against. Isolation makes it worse. Small, closed speech communities drift faster than large connected ones, because there is no outside population pulling usage back toward a shared standard. A generation ship is the most isolated speech community that has ever existed, with a few hundred to a few thousand speakers and no contact of any kind. Its language will change faster than any terrestrial language ever has. The specific failure this produces in a maintenance culture is worse than simply losing the manual. Technical vocabulary drifts away from the documentation until the words are still present, but no longer denote the same components. The manual still reads as instructions. it still appears to make sense. And following it produces confident wrong action, which is considerably more dangerous than having no manual at all. A crew that knows it, does not understand a procedure, will proceed carefully. A crew that misunderstands it fluently will not. Unit drift is the quiet version of the same catastrophe. If the ship redefines its units, and 2,000 years is more than long enough for that to happen innocently, then every historical measurement becomes uncheckable. The ship loses the ability to compare its current state to its own past, which is the only diagnostic tool it has for slow failures. Preserving physical standards matters more than preserving numbers. Actual reference masses. Actual reference lengths. Actual clocks. Picture that as an institution. A sealed case holding a metal cylinder of defined mass, checked annually by someone whose job title has changed 4 times, against a written procedure that has been retranslated 11 times, so that the ship can still prove to itself what a kilogram is. Which points at the real answer, and it is not an object. Rather than trying to build a medium that outlasts the voyage, build a culture whose job is to copy. This is the mechanism that actually worked on Earth. Texts crossed a European Dark Age not because anyone invented durable ink, but because copying was institutionalized, made prestigious, and given a framing that survived the collapse of everything around it. The technology was ordinary. The institution was not. Copying introduces error. Institutionalized copying, with collation, comparison of multiple exemplars, and formal correction procedures, controls error. The technique is old, thoroughly documented, and requires nothing the ship will lose. It is entirely a matter of whether the practice is still being performed in Generation 60. So the archive is a practice rather than an object. The ship needs archivists more than it needs archives, and it needs the archivist role to be prestigious enough that competent, enthusiastic people are still competing for it 2,000 years from departure. That is a cultural problem wearing a technical disguise, and it is the shape of nearly every problem in this ledger. There is a second technique for the language problem, and it comes from the same place. Alongside the drifting everyday speech, the ship teaches a deliberately frozen dialect, held still by ritual use rather than by everyday convenience. Several terrestrial traditions have done exactly this across exactly this timescale, maintaining a liturgical or technical language that changes almost not at all across 2 millennia, while the vernacular around it becomes unrecognizable. The frozen language is inefficient and slightly artificial, and it guarantees that the archive always has a trained readership. 3 smaller obligations sit underneath all of this, and none of them ever produces a visible benefit in any single generation, which is precisely why they are the ones most likely to lapse. Stored digital media degrade silently. Bits flip without announcing themselves, and a file can be intact by every casual measure while carrying corruption that only appears when it matters. The countermeasure is periodic verified migration, comparing copies against each other and rewriting them. It is a maintenance obligation that runs for 2,000 years and whose entire reward is that nothing happens. An archive too large to search is functionally empty. And search tools are software, which means the index has the shortest life of anything in the collection. A layered archive therefore needs a layered index, including a physical one that can be read the way a library card catalog is read. And diagrams travel better than prose. Drawings and schematics survive language barriers in a way sentences do not, which argues for an eye-readable layer that is heavily illustrated rather than heavily written. Redundancy still matters, and its geometry is specific. Multiple complete copies, physically separated within the ship so that no single compartment loss takes the record. held in different media so that no single failure mechanism takes all of them. And at least one copy that requires no ship power of any kind to read. There is one further question, and it is uncomfortable in a way the others are not. What should the archive deliberately omit? Serious arguments exist on both sides. There are arguments for excluding technical knowledge whose only application is weapons, and for excluding detailed political history that would import old terrestrial grievances into a society with no stake in them. Both amount to the founders deciding what 70 generations of descendants are permitted to know about their own origins. And both fail for a straightforward practical reason. A society that discovers it has been curated will trust nothing in the archive, including the parts that are true. The opposite failure is equally real. An archive containing everything contains every ideology, every historical atrocity, and every available reason for factional conflict, delivered intact to a sealed population that cannot separate from itself. There is no correct answer to this. There is only a choice, made once, by people who will not be there to see how it lands. Part 6. Teaching what no one has seen. The fifth requirement is maintaining competence in skills that will not be used for 2,000 years and must then be performed correctly on the first attempt. Everything in this section rests on a single distinction. Knowledge can be archived. Competence cannot. Competence lives in practiced bodies, and a written procedure for landing a vehicle does not produce a person who can land one. The archive holds descriptions of actions. It does not hold the actions. The terrestrial evidence on this is unambiguous and slightly alarming. Skills are lost within a generation or two of ceasing to be practiced, even when the documentation survives completely intact. Rebuilding a lost craft from documents alone typically takes years of systematically failed attempts, and the failures are not incidental. The failures are the mechanism by which the knowledge is recovered, because what the documents omit is exactly what the practitioners never thought to write down. And the skills this ship needs at the far end are precisely the ones it cannot practice. Deceleration. Atmospheric entry. Open-air agriculture. Field geology. Weather. Large-scale construction on a surface, in gravity that does not come from rotation. None of those can be rehearsed inside a sealed cylinder moving through vacuum. So the ship must simulate. On a crossing like this, simulators are not training aids. They are the only mechanism by which competence crosses a millennium, which makes them load-bearing hardware, maintained for 2,000 years, and it introduces a strange failure mode of its own. A simulator maintained across 70 generations by people who cannot check it against reality will slowly become a simulation of the previous simulator. The fidelity drifts, quietly, in whatever direction the maintenance happens to push it, and nobody aboard has any way to notice. Picture the consequence honestly. The arrival generation will attempt the most consequential physical task in the ship's history, using skills learned entirely from a machine, checked against a model built by people 2,000 years dead, on the first and only attempt. Everything in this section exists to make that moment survivable. Underneath the practical problem sits a quieter one, which is concept loss. Children born aboard will not have reference for horizon, weather, ocean, wilderness, crowd, wild animal, or night as an event rather than a lighting schedule. The words survive. The meanings hollow out. A child can learn the word ocean perfectly, use it correctly in a sentence, and mean by it something closer to a diagram than a place. Scale is teachable, but not transmissible. A child can be taught the number of kilometers in a light year, and can perform arithmetic with it flawlessly, and cannot be given the experience that makes the number mean anything. By the third generation, the distance the ship is crossing is a fact in a lesson rather than a felt quantity. The most important thing about the voyage becomes the least available thing aboard. Two physics are taught, and only one of them is testable. The physics of the ship's interior can be verified by experiment in an afternoon. Spin, pressure, thermal behavior, the strength of materials, the behavior of water in a rotating frame. A student can check all of it personally. The physics of planets, oceans, open skies, and weather is taught purely on authority, from records about places nobody aboard has been. That is a structural invitation to disbelief, and it identifies the most dangerous school of thought aboard. It is not rebellion. It is skepticism about the destination. In a population that has never seen a planet, the suspicion that the promised world at the far end is a story the founders told is not paranoia. It is an entirely reasonable inference from the available evidence held by intelligent people, and no argument from inside the hull can fully refute it. Which makes education the ship's largest industry, in a sense that is easy to underestimate. With a population of a few thousand and a requirement to maintain hundreds of specialized competencies indefinitely, the fraction of people engaged in teaching and training runs far higher than in any terrestrial society. A plausible design has most adults teaching part-time as a standing civic obligation, in the same way that jury service or militia duty has functioned elsewhere. Teaching is not a profession aboard. It is something almost everyone does. Redundancy in people is the core rule, and it is inflexible. For every essential skill, more than one practitioner and a documented succession. A ship where one person is the only competent welder is a ship one accident away from having lost welding, and welding is not a thing that can be relearned from a manual on a deadline. Apprenticeship beats schooling for tacit knowledge, which means the ship's economy and its education system are not two institutions but one. Work is where knowledge is stored, and the workplace is the archive that reads itself. There is a hard limit on specialization, though, and it comes straight from the population size. A ship of 2,000 people cannot carry a specialist in every subfield of medicine or engineering. The design answer is broad generalists, supported by an expert system, supported by the archive. And the expert system is electronics, with the shortest life of the three, which means the ship's medical capability degrades toward the competence of its generalists over centuries rather than staying level. The motivation problem is cultural rather than pedagogical, and it is the part no curriculum can fix. Teaching a child to master a skill they will never use, for a benefit they will never see, cannot be solved by better lesson design. The terrestrial solutions are skills as identity and skills as ritual. The craft is who you are, and its practice is a rite rather than a preparation. A guild remembers things a school forgets, because a guild is a form of belonging and a school is a service. Two smaller obligations deserve naming. The first is deliberate skill archaeology as a standing institution, periodically reconstructing a technique the ship has already lost from documentation alone as a training exercise. The point is not the technique. The point is to keep the reconstruction skill itself alive, so that when something is lost accidentally, there are people who have practiced recovering things. The second is pedagogy itself, which is a skill like any other and transmits like any other. A generation that teaches badly damages every generation after it, and the damage compounds silently. There is one asymmetry running through all of it that is worth stating on its own, because it is the section's real difficulty. The people who most need the arrival skills are the ones with the least contact with anyone who ever practiced them, and the greatest cultural distance from the mission's origin. Competence is required in inverse proportion to its availability. Every generation between departure and arrival is a generation in which the skills matter less and decay more, and the curve bottoms out shortly before the moment they are needed. Medical competence decays in a particular way that illustrates the whole problem. Conditions that do not occur aboard for 200 years still have to be recognizable when they reappear, from a description rather than from experience. A physician who has read about a disease is not the same instrument as a physician who has seen one, and the gap between those two widens with every generation in which the disease stays absent. Sensory calibration drifts too, in a way nobody aboard can detect. A population raised under a single artificial light spectrum develops color categories tuned to that spectrum, and those categories quietly affect everything from medical diagnosis to the assessment of a crop. There is no unaffected population to compare against, so the drift is invisible from inside by construction. And numeracy loses its footing. Intuition for large quantities is built by encountering them, and nothing aboard is larger than a few kilometers. The ship's inhabitants will handle astronomical numbers as symbols with perfect competence and no feel. This is the natural place to set the ledger down for a moment and gently restack it before the second half. 6 requirements are on the table. The ship needs something to stand on where consent would be, because nobody after the founders ever agrees to be there. It needs a government that survives 70 successions, in a village where everyone is related and there is no outside auditor. It needs a justice system with nowhere to send anyone, which turns out to mean reintegration by arithmetic rather than by principle. It needs an archive that is a practice rather than an object, held by archivists rather than by media. And it needs competence stored in bodies rather than in files, kept alive by simulation and ritual across a span in which none of it can be used. Underneath all 6 sits the same answer, arriving from different directions each time. Size. Spare capacity. More than one of everything. The second half of the ledger takes the same question into demography, into economy, into conflict, into meaning, and finally into collapse, and what recovery from collapse would require. Part 7. The population ledger. The 6th requirement is the one where the ship has no option but to legislate the body. Begin with the ceiling, because it is not a policy and cannot be argued with. A fixed volume, a fixed crop area, and a fixed life support throughput impose an absolute population limit, and the limit can be calculated before departure. Growth past that line is not undesirable. It is mechanically impossible. The numbers underneath the ceiling are simple and unforgiving. Each person consumes roughly 8/10 of a kilogram of oxygen per day and exhales roughly a kilogram of carbon dioxide. Comfortable living moves tens of kilograms of water per person per day through the recovery loop. Each person radiates around 100 watts of metabolic heat, and every watt of it has to be rejected to vacuum through radiators of finite area. And feeding one person takes on the order of 20 to 40 square meters of intensive crop area, plus roughly as much again in processing, storage, and support. Multiply any one of those by a population and the ceiling appears immediately. 10,000 people means around 8 tons of oxygen consumed and 10 tons of carbon dioxide produced every day, roughly a megawatt of body heat to throw away, and something like 200,000 square meters of growing area, which is about 50 acres of farmland folded inside a spinning structure. The ceiling is not a decision anyone makes. It is an area, a wattage, and a mass flow. Now the harder half, which is holding a population steady against that ceiling for 70 generations. A stable population requires fertility held near replacement, sustained continuously. No human society has ever held fertility at a deliberate target for even 10 generations without either coercion or an unusual combination of prosperity, education, and available contraception. Fertility on Earth moves, sometimes sharply, in response to conditions nobody controls. A ship needs it to sit still for 2,000 years. And both failure directions are lethal, which is what makes this the hardest requirement in the ledger. Above replacement, the population overshoots the life support ceiling. What follows is rationing, then a demographic correction the ship did not choose and cannot manage humanely, because the correction is either famine or a sudden and severe restriction imposed in an emergency. Below replacement, the population shrinks toward two flaws at the same time. The first is the genetic flaw, below which diversity cannot recover. The second is the competence flaw, below which skills cannot be maintained regardless of how many people remain. The second flaw is almost certainly the higher of the two, and it is almost never modeled. The genetic arithmetic is worth having in plain form. Heterozygosity, which is the practical measure of how much variation a population still carries, falls by roughly 1/2 the effective population size in each generation. Effective population size is typically around 1/3 of the head count, and it falls further with unequal family sizes or a skewed sex ratio. So a ship carrying 600 people may be behaving genetically like a population of 200 and losing variation at a rate set by the smaller number rather than the larger one. The founder effect sets a harder limit still, and it operates on day one. Any genetic variant rarer than about 1 in a few hundred is simply absent from a crew of a few hundred. Not depleted, absent. And it cannot be recovered by any later breeding program, because breeding rearranges existing variation and does not create missing variation. Whatever the founders do not carry aboard is gone from that lineage of humanity permanently. There is a terrestrial evidence base for what small closed gene pools actually do, and it is gentler than the arithmetic suggests. Island and settler populations founded by a few dozen people show, after 8 or 10 generations, conditions concentrated far above their global rates, sometimes by 3 orders of magnitude. What stands out in the record is not the medical outcome, but the social one. Affected communities tend to reorganize around the result, rather than treating it as affliction, adapting work, architecture, and daily rhythm to the trait that has become common. Small, closed populations do not simply suffer their genetics. They accommodate them, and the accommodation becomes culture. 2 parameters deserve naming because they move the numbers more than they look as though they should. Sex ratio is 1. A skewed ratio can halve the effective genetic size of a crew without changing its head count at all, which means the ship's demographic health depends on a variable no institution can control directly. Infertility is the other. Measured infertility rates dominate multi-generational population simulations, and they are among the least predictable inputs available, especially in an environment with radiation exposure and gravity conditions no human lineage has experienced. Which is why the estimates span 2 orders of magnitude. Under strictly managed reproduction, with assigned pairings, controlled numbers of children, and active avoidance of relatedness, on the order of 100 founders can suffice. Under free reproductive choice, and a requirement to carry a representative sample of human variation rather than merely a viable one, the figure rises into the thousands, and in the strictest treatments, into the tens of thousands. That gap is the central political fact of the ship, and it is not a scientific dispute at all. It is the price of reproductive freedom, quoted in tons of habitat. Genetic health can be purchased with mass or with coercion, and the founders decide which currency their descendants will pay in, 70 generations before the last payment is made. There is one technical answer that changes the shape of the problem, and it deserves attention because it is the most consequential idea in this section. Banked gametes and embryos, drawn from a terrestrial donor pool, orders of magnitude larger than the crew, decouple genetic diversity from headcount entirely. A ship of a few hundred people can carry the genetic variation of tens of thousands in a freezer. Diversity is no longer something the living population has to embody. It is stored, separately, and drawn on as needed. That is arguably the single most important answer to the ship's hardest social problem, because it removes the need for assigned pairings and mandated child numbers as instruments of genetic management. Reproduction can be free because diversity is held elsewhere. A governance problem becomes a refrigeration problem. The caveats are serious and should not be skipped. Cryogenic storage across 2,000 years is unproven and cannot be proven in advance, because the only test that matters takes 2,000 years. The bank becomes a critical single point of failure with an absurd duty cycle. And it raises the question of who decides which stored genomes become people, which is a governance problem again, merely relocated from the bedroom to the committee room. The coercion has not been eliminated. It has been moved somewhere less visible. Age structure is the quieter half of demography, and it behaves in ways that surprise people. A fixed population at replacement produces a stable age pyramid, but only if births are spread evenly through time. Cohort clumping breaks that. A baby boom propagates through the ship's institutions for a full century, producing alternating shortages of teachers, then of workers, then of carers, in a wave that outlives every person who caused it. A single unusually good decade in which more couples than usual decide to have children becomes an institutional problem 4 times over across the following 100 years. The dependency ratio has no external labor market to absorb it. On Earth, a shortage of carers is met by hiring, by immigration, or by importing services. Aboard, every carer is a person taken from another essential job, and there is nowhere to hire from. The arithmetic is closed in every direction, which brings the section to the place where the ship's ethics stop resembling ours. Medical decisions under a hard ceiling carry an explicit population cost. End-of-life care, elective treatment, and resource-intensive intervention all have a calculable price in crop area, water throughput, and radiator load. Terrestrial medicine is able to leave that price implicit, and does, deliberately, because making it explicit would change how people are treated. The ship cannot leave it implicit because the numbers are visible to everyone on the public telemetry that its constitution requires. Reproductive licensing is the mechanism most frequently proposed in this subject and least frequently examined. A society that allocates permission to have children holds a permanent, intimate, and unavoidable coercive relationship with every adult aboard, sustained across 70 generations. It is the clearest instance of the tyranny failure mode named at the start, and it arrives not through malice but through arithmetic. Nobody has to want it. It simply follows from a ceiling and a requirement not to hit it. And here is the mitigation, which is also the answer this ledger keeps arriving at. Make the ceiling high enough that the license almost never binds. Spare capacity is the mechanism by which freedom is purchased. Every extra ton of habitat, every extra square meter of crop area, every extra kilowatt of radiator margin is a measurable reduction in the amount of coercion the society will require of itself. Which is the strongest argument anywhere in this subject for building the largest possible ship rather than the most efficient one? Efficiency on a 2,000-year crossing is a synonym for coercion. The slack is the point. Part 8. An economy inside a fixed volume. The seventh requirement is a way of allocating everything, forever, with no trade, no growth, and nowhere for wealth to go. Almost every terrestrial economic assumption fails aboard, and it fails at the root rather than at the edges. There is no external demand, so nothing is produced for anyone outside. There is no new land, so nothing appreciates. There is no growth, because growth is bounded by the ceiling from the previous section. And there is no trade, which removes the mechanism by which every human economy has historically converted a local surplus into something else. What remains genuinely scarce is a short and physical list. Volume, mass, electrical power, cooling capacity, crop area, and human attention, which turns out to be the scarcest of all. What is not scarce, in the ordinary sense, is manufactured goods, provided the fabrication and recycling loops work properly. A ship that can remelt and remake its own material has abundance in objects and permanent scarcity in space, energy, and heat rejection. That is an unfamiliar combination. Things are cheap. Room is not. Warmth is not, because every watt has to leave. The result is an economy of allocation rather than accumulation. There is nothing to invest in, because there is no future expansion to invest toward, and nowhere for wealth to go, because wealth on earth is ultimately a claim on land, labor, or growth, and the ship has a fixed supply of the first two and none of the third. Hoarding mass becomes antisocial in a literal thermodynamic sense. Material sitting idle in a private store is material removed from the loop that keeps everyone breathing. Which raises the question of what people actually do. A well-designed ship automates most routine operation, and it does so for a specific reason. Depending on human vigilance for 2,000 years is a bad bet, because vigilance degrades and boredom is reliable. So the machinery watches itself, and the remaining human work is maintenance, agriculture, care, teaching, governance, and repair. There may well be more people aboard than there is necessary work to do. Underemployment is a hazard rather than a benefit, and this is one of the better established findings in the whole subject. Long isolation research consistently identifies meaningful occupation as a primary determinant of psychological stability, and identifies monotony and purposelessness as principal degradation channels. People in confined environments do not suffer from overwork. They suffer from having nothing that needs them. So the ship may need to manufacture work, to deliberately keep processes human in the loop that could be automated, because the loop exists for the human rather than for the process. That is an uncomfortable design principle, and it should be named honestly rather than dressed up as craftsmanship. The ship is not keeping people in the loop because they are better at the job. It is keeping them there because a person who is not needed by anything becomes a problem the ship has no other tool to solve. There is a slower trap in the same direction, and it works by increments. Each generation that automates a task loses the ability to perform it manually because nobody practices what the machine does. That is efficient and rational at every individual step. Over centuries, it produces a ship in which the automation cannot be repaired by anyone who still understands what it is for, and the loss is not noticed until something breaks. Allocation itself becomes a permanent institution rather than an emergency measure. Rationing on Earth is what happens during a war, and it ends. Aboard, the distribution of crop area, water, and power margin is simply how the economy works, every day, forever, which means the question of who sets the allocation is a standing political question rather than a crisis one. Status follows, And status does not disappear simply because money has. Humans stratify. If property and currency are weak instruments, status attaches instead to skill, to office, to lineage, or to access. Of those four, skill-based status is by far the healthiest, and it requires that skills be visible and independently verifiable, which links directly back to the public telemetry. A society where competence can be checked is a society where reputation tracks something real. Which brings us to the most important practical point in this section, and it is not about economics at all. It is about prestige. The ship's survival depends on unglamorous, repetitive inspection work. Walking the same corridor, checking the same seal, logging the same number, which has been the same number for 400 years and will be the same number tomorrow. Nothing about that work is interesting, and everything about the ship depends on it being done attentively by people who have never once found anything wrong. Terrestrial societies systematically under-honor maintenance relative to creation. Building is celebrated. Inventing is celebrated. Keeping something working is invisible, and the people who do it are noticed only when they fail. A ship that inherits that bias dies of it, quietly, over about 3 generations, as the best people drift toward the work that earns respect, and the seals get checked by whoever is left. So deliberately inverting the prestige gradient is a cultural engineering requirement, rather than a nicety. The ship needs its most admired people to be the ones who check things. That is not a natural state and cannot be legislated. It has to be built into ritual, into language, into who gets to speak first at a gathering. Imagine the annual inspection walk performed in ceremonial order by the most senior people aboard, along a route that has not changed in 600 years, past seals that have never failed and are checked anyway, because the checking is the point. Underneath the culture sits the industrial base, and the numbers there are stark. 2,000 years is roughly 40 times the demonstrated operating life of any spacecraft. Nothing can be stocked, because stocking implies a finite number of replacements, and the ship needs an unbounded supply. It must be able to manufacture every part it contains, recovery and reprocessing of its own materials, metallurgy, polymer synthesis, and some form of electronics fabrication. Electronics is the hard one, and the honest answer is a deliberate downgrade. A society of a few thousand people cannot support a semiconductor industry at modern feature sizes, and pretending otherwise is how a ship acquires a 50-year failure date. The realistic design choice is coarse, robust, manufacturable electronics rather than advanced ones, plus a mechanical, non-electronic backup layer underneath every function that must never fail. Valves that can be turned by hand. Gauges that work without power. Controls that a person can operate while the computers are down. Standardization is survival. Fewer part types, more interchangeability, more repairability. A ship optimized for performance is a ship that cannot fix itself, and a ship that cannot fix itself has a 50-year life regardless of what its designers intended. Every gain in sophistication is a loss in the number of people capable of maintaining it. The material loop has known leaks, and they are element-specific. Hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus are the 4 that escape closed systems, through seals, through airlocks, through processes that bind them into forms the loop cannot recover. Losses of a fraction of a % per year compound over 2,000 years into total loss. Either the loop's close to a precision never yet demonstrated, or the ship carries reserves sized for millennia, or it collects matter from the interstellar medium as it goes. And buffer volume is the practical measure of resilience, measured in days rather than percentages. A large ship's atmosphere and water reserves give its crew weeks to diagnose a fault before conditions become dangerous. A small ship's give them hours. Size is safety, and safety is time, which is the same conclusion this ledger has now reached from 4 different directions. The sealed biosphere record shows why that time matters, and it is the most instructive experiment ever run on this question. The largest closed ecological system ever built sealed a little over a hectare of ground and roughly 200,000 cubic meters of volume, with a small crew inside, for 2 years. Its atmospheric oxygen fell from a normal 20.9% to around 14.5% over roughly 16 months, a decline averaging about 140 parts per million per day. The cause was not a leak, and not a failure of the life support hardware. It was soil microbial respiration consuming oxygen faster than photosynthesis replaced it, combined with carbon dioxide being absorbed into unsealed concrete inside the structure. And that second half is the important part, because the concrete removed the very signal that would have revealed what was happening. The carbon dioxide that should have accumulated as evidence was quietly being taken out of the air. One detail from the subsequent modeling deserves to be the section's closing fact. The observed oxygen decline would have been completely hidden by a leak rate as low as 1% per day. A slightly leakier structure would have produced the same dangerous loss with no diagnostic trace whatsoever. The lesson is not that closed loops fail. It is that they fail invisibly, through interactions between subsystems nobody was watching together, and that the tighter the closure, the more legible the failure becomes. Which makes monitoring the primary activity aboard rather than a support function. On a 2,000-year crossing, the most important thing anyone does is notice. Part 9. Conflict with no outlet. The 8th requirement is that disagreement has to be survivable, repeatedly, for 2,000 years, inside a volume from which nobody can walk away. Conflict is guaranteed. Over 70 generations, the ship will produce political factions, religious schisms, generational conflicts, occupational rivalries, and family feuds, because human populations always do. A design that assumes otherwise has not been thought about seriously. The question is never whether conflict arrives. It is what conflict does when it cannot go anywhere. On Earth, serious disagreement is resolved, ultimately, by separation. One group moves. This is the mechanism underneath emigration, schism, secession, and the founding of nearly every settlement in human history. When 2 groups can no longer share a life, they stop sharing a place, and the disagreement becomes geography instead of violence. The ship's defining constraint is that separation is impossible without partition, which means conflict changes character rather than intensity. It becomes chronic instead of acute. Grievances do not resolve aboard. X's will continue to drift. The stars overhead may appear eternal, but the great web of galaxies is always in motion. A dispute between 2 families in Generation 10 is still a live fact in Generation 30, carried by people who were not present for the original injury, who cannot verify any account of it, and who nonetheless know exactly which side they are on. The feud outlives the reason for the feud, which is a pattern well documented in small, isolated communities on Earth, and which the ship reproduces with no possibility of the usual escape. Stratification arrives next, and it arrives without anyone intending it, which is what makes it difficult to prevent. Any habitat large enough to house thousands has districts. Districts acquire identities. Deck-level cultures, accent differences, and occupational clustering emerge within a few generations of a population being spatially sorted, and spatial sorting happens by default because people live near their work and marry their neighbors. Nobody designs a ship with quarters. ships acquire quarters. Occupational inheritance is the likeliest engine of the process, and it follows directly from the education section. Apprenticeship-based training naturally follows families, because families are who work alongside each other. A ship that trains children in their parents' trades produces a caste system in 3 generations, with nobody having decided to build one and everyone able to explain why their own case is reasonable. The countermeasures are known, and all of them are expensive. Rotation of residents, so that districts do not harden into lineages. Cross-training across occupational lines, so that no trade becomes a bloodline. Institutions that deliberately cut across districts, shared festivals, shared obligations, shared schooling that mixes children who would otherwise never meet. All of those cost efficiency, every year, permanently. And all of them must be maintained by generations who have long since forgotten why the rule exists. That is the recurring pattern of this entire ledger, stated once more in a new place. The rules that matter most are the ones whose purpose is invisible to the people keeping them. A rotation requirement that has prevented a caste system for 400 years looks, to the people subject to it, like pointless disruption. Its success is indistinguishable from its being unnecessary. Language follows the districts, and it works as both symptom and accelerant. Accent divergence between quarters begins within a generation or two of spatial sorting, and it does more than mark identity. It makes cross-district communications slightly harder, slightly more effortful, slightly more likely to be misread, which reduces contact, which increases divergence. The mechanism is self-reinforcing and entirely automatic, and it operates on a timescale far shorter than the crossing. Scale creates a distinctive hazard of its own around individuals. In a population of 2,000, one unusually persuasive person represents a significant fraction of the society's total influence. On Earth, a charismatic figure has to compete with millions of other voices and dozens of institutions. Aboard, a single compelling speaker can reach every adult personally, more than once, within a year. The ship has no dilution, and there is a structural gap in every dispute resolution mechanism the ship can build, which is the absence of a neutral third party. Mediation on Earth works because someone can be found who is genuinely uninvolved. In a population where everyone is embedded in every relationship, where the mediator is also a cousin, a neighbor, a former apprentice, and a creditor, neutrality does not exist to be found. It has to be simulated procedurally, and everyone involved knows it is being simulated. There is also the question nobody wants to put on the agenda, which is weapons. Whether the ship carries any, who holds them, and what a society does about the fact that an industrial base capable of making replacement parts is an industrial base capable of making other things, regardless of what the founders decided to load. The most serious scenario is schism. A faction that no longer accepts the legitimacy of the ship's governance inside a hull that cannot be divided. The options there are suppression, accommodation, or partition. Suppression requires a coercive apparatus, and a coercive apparatus maintained for centuries stops being a tool of the government and becomes the government. Accommodation works well, and it works until the disagreement concerns something that cannot be split, the mission itself, or the allocation of the crop area, or who has authority over the reactor. Partition is the only genuine answer, and it is the same answer that appeared in the second section under a different name. 2 or more habitat modules, mechanically joined and socially independent, each able to support a population above both the genetic floor and the competence floor. It roughly doubles the minimum viable population and roughly doubles the mass, which makes it the most expensive line in the ledger. It is the price of the ability to disagree. There is a darker vulnerability that has to be named, because a sealed habitat is extraordinarily exposed to a single determined person. Every critical system is a potential hostage. The oxygen plant, the water loop, the reactor, the seed vault, and every potential hostage taker is somebody's child, known to everyone, with a name and a history and a family who will still be aboard afterward. Terrestrial security thinking relies on redundancy, compartmentalization, and monitoring, and all three transfer aboard. But the ship must add an assumption that inverts most of the discipline. The adversary cannot be removed, cannot be excluded, and will still be present in 30 years. There is no perimeter, because there is no outside from which a threat could come, which produces a trade with no clean answer. Monitoring sufficient to make sabotage genuinely impossible would also make privacy impossible. And privacy is a documented requirement for psychological health in confinement, not a preference that can be economized away. Every increment of surveillance buys security and spends stability, and the exchange rate is unknown. That trade cannot be settled once. It has to be relitigated by every generation, in different conditions, with different threats and different tolerances. Which means what the ship actually needs is not a correct answer, but institutions capable of revisiting the question repeatedly without tearing themselves apart in the process. And here is the point that keeps this section from ending in despair, because it is easy to read all of the above as an argument that a sealed society is simply doomed to grind itself down. Societies that suppress all conflict become brittle, and then they shatter. This is one of the more consistent findings in the historical record. Institutionalized, bounded, ritualized conflict is how a society changes without tearing itself apart. Courts, elections, contests, formal argument with rules and a conclusion. Sport, which is conflict with a scoreboard and a handshake. Craft competitions, which are conflict with a judge and a prize. So the ship does not need disagreement to be absent. It needs disagreement to be safe. Those are completely different design targets, and the second one is achievable. Several mechanisms follow from that reframe and are worth naming. Ritualized competition as a scheduled pressure release rather than an occasional entertainment. Reconciliation ceremonies held on the calendar rather than in response to particular events, so that the machinery of repair is practiced before it is needed. And sanctuary space as an architectural right, designated volumes where a person cannot be pursued, argued with, or assigned work, which gives the closest available substitute for walking out of a room and closing the door. There is one problem the ship cannot mechanism its way out of, and it belongs to the mission specifically. The young inherit a project chosen by the dead. Every single generation has legitimate grounds to ask why it should continue, and for 68 of those generations, the honest answer is that they will not personally benefit in any way. The distance is not shortening in any sense they can perceive. The destination is not visible. The people who chose this are unreachable. So the society must be able to survive that question being asked out loud, repeatedly, forever. Which means the answer cannot be that you are not allowed to ask. A ship whose only defense of its mission is prohibition has already failed the tyranny test, and it has failed it at the exact moment it most needed to pass. Part 10. Meaning for people who will never arrive. The 9th requirement is the one the technical literature most consistently skips, and it may be the one the ship actually turns on. Of roughly 70 generations, one departs and one arrives. 68 live and die entirely in transit. They are not an inconvenience in the mission plan. They are the ship's actual population, and a design that treats them as passengers is a design that has misidentified its own subject. The mission cannot be their source of meaning, because the mission's payoff is unreachable for them. This is not a failure of spirit or a lack of dedication. It is arithmetic. A person born in generation 30 will spend an entire life aboard, raise children aboard, and die aboard, and the distance to the destination will have closed by about 1/70th during their lifetime, in a direction they cannot perceive. Purpose has to come from the life itself, not from where the life is going. So the serious treatments of this subject converge on a reframe, and it is the single most important idea in the whole discussion. The ship is not a vehicle. It is a world. Its inhabitants are not travelers. They are residents. The crossing is not an interval to be endured. It is the entire history of a civilization that happens to be in motion. Once that reframe is accepted, the design question changes completely. It stops being how do we keep people functional for 2,000 years, which is a question about maintenance, and becomes what kind of world would you want your descendants to spend 70 generations inside, which is a question about architecture, culture, and generosity. The evidence that the reframe is necessary, rather than merely kinda, is reasonably solid. Long isolation research identifies purpose, autonomy, and meaningful work as the strongest protective factors in confined environments. It also finds mission-focused framing insufficient over long durations, because a mission with a distant payoff recedes rather than motivates. Short missions are carried by the goal. Long ones are not. The goal stops functioning as fuel and starts functioning as background. Which means the ship has to manufacture time, and that is a stranger requirement than it sounds. A world with no seasons, no weather, and no astronomical events has nothing that structures a year. Nothing arrives. Nothing changes. The interior conditions are identical in what would be January and what would be July, and there is no external referent to distinguish them. So the ship needs invented festivals, marked anniversaries, engineered seasons in the agricultural zones, and a deliberately chosen day length. These are not decoration. They are the mechanism by which a population experiences time as structured rather than uniform, and without them, a life aboard becomes one very long, undifferentiated day. The engineered day is a real design decision, with a governance dimension attached. The human internal clock runs slightly longer than 24 hours when left to itself, which means the ship's day length is a committee choice that everybody aboard then lives inside for a lifetime. Somebody decides. Everybody adapts. Bounded random variation turns out to be a requirement too, which is counterintuitive. Perfect regularity in lighting and climate reads as artificial and becomes quietly oppressive. A ship needs weather it does not appear to control precisely, small unpredictable variations in temperature and light and air movement, because an environment that never surprises anyone stops registering as a place. And art, sport, and craft are load-bearing infrastructure rather than amenities. Anything that gives a person a reason to look forward to next week is a life support system and should be budgeted as one, in mass and power and space, alongside the oxygen plant. This is the part of the design that looks most like waste on a spreadsheet and is least optional in practice. The calendar has to hold the personal alongside the ceremonial, and one of those items is heavier than it first appears. In a closed material loop, the ship has to decide what is done with the dead, and every available answer becomes central to the culture rather than peripheral to it. Whatever is chosen, it is performed a few thousand times over the crossing, in the same place, by people who all know each other, and it will end up carrying more meaning than anything the founders wrote down. Lineage records do similar work from the other direction. In a population where everyone is related, naming conventions and genealogy are not sentiment. They are identity infrastructure, and they double as the demographic instrument the population section requires. The family tree is a public document and a management tool at the same time. Some of the ship's art will be about the destination, and that raises a real editorial question with no clean answer. Should children be taught the destination accurately, with all its uncertainty and its 4-century-old data, or hopefully, in a way that sustains them? Accuracy and morale are not the same objective, and a culture will drift toward one of them, whether or not anyone chooses. Music deserves a specific mention because it is the most durable art form across language drift. Melodies survive lyrics by a wide margin, and tunes can carry across centuries of linguistic change, while the words attached to them become opaque. A ship that wants something to travel the whole crossing intact should probably put it in a song. Then there is the question the founders cannot avoid and cannot solve, which is religion. On the terrestrial evidence, religion is by far the strongest candidate for 2,000-year institutional continuity. Nothing else comes close. Religious institutions have held identity, practice, language, and archive across exactly this span, repeatedly through the collapse of every political structure around them. If the founders want a mechanism with a demonstrated 2-millennium track record, there is essentially one on offer. It is also the one thing they cannot specify, because belief that is issued does not function like belief that is held. A religion designed by a committee to serve an institutional purpose is a set of procedures, and procedures do not do what faith does. What the founders can be certain of is that belief systems will emerge aboard whether or not they are planned, and that those systems will be shaped by the ship's conditions. Consider what those conditions are. A sealed world, an unreachable origin, a promised destination nobody has seen, an inherited purpose, and a founding generation who witnessed the origin with their own eyes and wrote it down before they died. Structurally, that is a scripture, and it will be read as one eventually whether it was intended that way or not. The founders, therefore, have 3 options, and honesty about all 3 is the best available position. Leave space for it, which is honest and unpredictable. Seed it deliberately, which is effective and manipulative and works. Or attempt to prevent it, which has no successful terrestrial precedent at this timescale and tends to produce exactly what it forbids in less visible forms. Alongside whatever emerges, Earth itself becomes antiquity, and this is not a slow process. Within a few generations, Earth is a place known the way we know the classical world. Real, thoroughly documented, permanently unvisitable. And it will be idealized, because unreachable origins always are, and because the documentation shows a world with oceans and weather and open sky to people living in a corridor. Idealized origins are politically potent. A faction that wants to go back is a predictable development rather than an exotic scenario, and the ship cannot. That is a permanent structural grievance built into the vehicle itself. Picture the founding recordings, played once a year on the departure anniversary. In a language the audience now needs subtitles for. Watched by people who know those faces the way we know faces from ancient portraiture, individual, documented, and permanently unavailable for comment. The destination gets the same treatment from the other end. For 68 generations, it is a point of light and a set of inherited numbers. Believing in it is an act of trust in ancestors nobody has met, about measurements nobody aboard can independently verify. A society that loses that trust does not necessarily stop if the ship cannot turn around. But it arrives without intending to, and what arrives is not what was sent. Which brings this section to the framing that is both the most humane and, on the evidence, the most accurate. The middle generations are not in transit toward a payoff. They are themselves the achievement. A human civilization sustaining itself indefinitely on nothing but the sunlight it brought with it and the discipline of its own institutions is not a waiting room. It is the most difficult thing our species would ever have done, performed continuously by people whose names will not be remembered at either end of the journey. There is a moment worth marking in the middle of that. Somewhere near the midpoint, one generation becomes the first for whom the destination is nearer than the origin. Nothing physical changes. No instrument reads differently. But the ship's relationship to both ends inverts, and a culture that has spent 1,000 years looking backward has a reason to turn around. It is the only genuine event in the entire crossing that requires no external cause, and it would almost certainly become the most important date in the calendar. Part 11. Recovering from failure. The 10th requirement is the one that follows from taking 2,000 years seriously. The ship must be designed on the assumption that its society will collapse at least once, and must survive its own collapse. Over that span, something will go badly wrong, and it will not be a component. It will be civilizational. A plague moving through a population with a simplified immune history and no external medicine. A schism that fractures the crew for a century. A famine following a crop collapse that nobody diagnosed in time. A generation that stops teaching properly for reasons that seemed adequate at the time. A period of concentrated authority that never returns itself. A war fought in corridors over something that mattered enormously and will be unintelligible 3 centuries later. Terrestrial societies recover from events like these because there is an outside, neighbors who still know the technique, trade that restores the missing goods, immigration that replaces the missing people, and surviving copies held elsewhere of whatever was destroyed locally. Every recovery in human history has drawn on something that was not inside the affected region. A ship has none of that, which makes the design question not only how to prevent collapse, but how to recover from one. And that second question is almost never modeled, which is where the 2 flaws matter. The genetic flaw is well studied. Below a certain effective population size, diversity cannot recover, and the population carries the consequences permanently. The number is debated, but the mechanism is understood. The competence flaw is almost certainly higher, and it is almost never calculated. Below a certain number of trained practitioners, a skill cannot be maintained regardless of how many people survive. 10,000 people with no welders cannot weld. The knowledge is not distributed thinly across the population. It sits in a handful of individuals, and when those individuals are gone, the capability is gone with them, even though the population looks healthy by every other measure. So a competence collapse has a distinctive shape, and it is worth stating precisely. The population survives. The archive survives. And nobody alive knows how to operate the system the archive describes. That is the most likely catastrophic scenario aboard, and it is the one that hardware redundancy does absolutely nothing to address. You can carry 3 of every pump. You cannot carry 3 of every person who understands the pump. Recovery, therefore, requires a reboot path. A documented, eye-readable, minimally technological route from a reduced and de-skilled population back to full operation, written for readers who have lost the vocabulary it was originally written in. That is an archive problem, a translation problem, and an education problem simultaneously, and it has to be prepared by people who will never know whether it worked. Which points at a governing principle that inverts normal spacecraft design. The ship should be built so that its life-critical functions require the least sophistication, and its sophisticated functions are the ones that fail first. Air, water, food, and shielding must be maintainable by a reduced, less skilled population working from simple instructions. Comfort, communication, and science can be allowed to go. This is called graceful degradation, and on a conventional spacecraft, it is almost exactly backwards, because there, the critical systems are the most advanced ones. On a 2,000-year vehicle, criticality and simplicity have to be deliberately correlated, at enormous cost in efficiency, against every instinct a good engineer has. From that principle follows the idea of a minimum viable ship inside the ship. A core habitat that a much smaller population can run alone, so that a collapse produces a survivable retreat rather than a total loss. It is the ship's lifeboat, and the lifeboat has to be able to sail for 1,000 years, which is a strange sentence and an accurate one. There is a paradox buried in that, and it should not be glossed over. A retreat volume large enough to be genuinely viable is also large enough to be a faction's destination during a schism. The lifeboat that saves the ship from collapse is the same structure that makes a permanent split practical. Every redundancy the ship builds against one failure mode is a resource available to another. Physical constraint returns here in its final role as recovery insurance. If the ship cannot stop and cannot turn, then even a society that has forgotten everything still arrives. Automated braking requiring no crew decision converts a civilizational collapse from mission fatal into merely tragic. The people who arrive may understand nothing about why they are there, and they will still be there. The counter-argument is strong and deserves to be given properly. Fully automated systems that must work correctly after 2,000 years of neglect are precisely the systems least likely to work. Automation has a shorter demonstrated life than institutions do, by a wide margin. A mechanism sealed and unattended for 20 centuries, expected to fire once, correctly, on schedule, is not a safety feature. It is a hope. This tension is real and unresolved, and the honest position is that neither the human path nor the automatic path is reliable on its own. The biological loops have their own recovery problem, and it is quieter than the mechanical one. A crop collapse or a pathogen sweep through the agricultural zones is survivable only if the ship holds seed stock and starter cultures capable of restarting the system from close to nothing. Which means the seed vault and the microbial cultures are as critical as the reactor, and face exactly the same question as the gamete bank in the population section: whether stored biological material can be relied upon after 2,000 years, when the only test that matters takes 2,000 years to run. And recovery is slower than collapse by a wide margin, which is the arithmetic that gets forgotten. A population halved by a plague does not rebuild in a generation. At replacement-level fertility, it does not rebuild at all, and even at deliberately elevated fertility, it needs several generations to return to its previous number, all of them operating with reduced competence in every trade. So a collapse is not an event followed by a return to normal. It is an event followed by a century or more of diminished capability, during which the ship is far more vulnerable to the next thing that goes wrong. Which is the real danger. Not any single failure, but the way a first failure lowers the threshold for the second. Which brings the ledger to the answer it has been circling for 10 sections. Multiple ships. A fleet traveling together is the only architecture that supplies an outside, and once that is said, nearly every problem in this discussion changes character. Genetic exchange between crews, which dissolves the founder effect arithmetic and removes the case for managed reproduction. Skill exchange, which raises the competence floor by pooling practitioners. Redundant archives held in genuinely independent locations. An emigration valve, which restores the mechanism that makes inherited membership tolerable. A comparison case against which corruption and drift become visible from outside rather than having to be detected from within. And a rescue capability, which is the thing no single ship can ever have. Almost every hard problem in this ledger is softened by having more than one ship. Almost none of them is fully solved without it. The cost is that a fleet multiplies mass, propulsion requirement, and founding population, roughly in proportion to the number of hulls, which converts a hard problem into an expensive one. And that is the best trade available anywhere in this entire subject, because expensive problems have a known solution path, and hard ones do not. Fleet architecture brings its own questions, and they are worth naming rather than waving away. Spacing is a real constraint. Ships close enough to help each other are close enough to collide over 2,000 years of accumulated navigation error, and ships far enough apart to be safe have a conversation delay measured in minutes or hours. And governance across hulls is genuinely undetermined. Whether the ships are politically independent, federated, or subordinate to a single flagship changes everything, including what happens when one of them changes its mind about the destination. Two smaller institutions belong to this section, and both are about rehearsal. The first is the scheduled Dark Age drill. Deliberately operating the ship with reduced information and reduced tooling on a calendar as a standing exercise. Not a crisis simulation, but a practice of doing without, so that the skills of improvisation and reconstruction are alive in a population that has never needed them. The second is honesty about the ship's own history. A society that knows it has failed before governs differently from one that believes it never has. The written record of a collapse is a governance asset rather than an embarrassment, and the temptation to sand it smooth will exist in every generation that inherits it. The summary is simple enough to state in one sentence. A single ship must be designed on the assumption that it will fail once and survive its own failure. A fleet does not need that assumption, which is why the fleet is the answer. Part 12. What would actually have to be true? The ledger can be assembled now, and it is worth reading as a single list because the shape of it is the answer. First, a population large enough that reproduction can be free rather than licensed. Thousands rather than hundreds. Or, failing that, a stored gamete bank that buys genetic diversity without coercion. The cost is mass, or a freezer with a 2,000-year duty cycle and no way to test it in advance. Second, spare capacity in volume, mass, power, and crop area, so that the population ceiling rarely binds and coercion is rarely required. The cost is the entire efficiency case for the mission. The benefit is freedom, measured directly, in square meters. Third, a charter with a real amendment procedure, and a mission made physically unnecessary to preserve, so that institutional drift becomes harmless. The cost is that the ship must be unable to turn around, which forecloses every option its descendants might one day want, in order to protect the one option the founders wanted. Fourth, a justice system built on reintegration, because exile, execution, and imprisonment are all unaffordable. The cost is that the ship must decide, in advance and in writing, what it will do with the person it cannot fix. Fifth, a layered archive with an eye-readable base layer, plus an institutionalized copying and translation practice. The cost is mass and a prestigious archivist class that has to remain prestigious for 70 generations without ever producing a visible result. Sixth, competence held in practiced bodies. Redundant practitioners for every essential skill. Simulators maintained for 2 millennia against a reality nobody can check. And a culture that makes maintenance the highest status work aboard. The cost is that most adults teach part-time, forever. Seventh, a manufacturable technology base. Coarse, robust, repairable, standardized, with a mechanical backup layer beneath everything critical. The cost is a deliberate and permanent technological downgrade chosen at departure in full knowledge of what is being given up. Eighth, a manufactured calendar, invented seasons, and a culture of ritual, art, craft, and sport substantial enough to give 68 middle generations reasons of their own. The cost is budgeted mass and power for things that do nothing measurable, defended against every future accountant who notices them. Ninth, an exit substitute. Internal partition at minimum, so that irreconcilable disagreement has somewhere to go. The cost is roughly double the minimum viable population, and a door that everyone hopes stays open. 10th, a reboot path and graceful degradation, so that the ship survives its own collapse. The cost is that criticality and simplicity must be correlated against every instinct of good engineering. And 11th, the requirement that makes all the others easier rather than merely possible, more than one ship. That is the ledger. It is longer than most treatments of this subject, and it contains nothing exotic. Which brings us to the counterweight, and it matters that it comes at the end rather than being smuggled in earlier. None of this is physically forbidden. Every single item on that list is a known problem with at least one known partial answer. There is no line in it that violates a law of nature, requires an undiscovered physical principle, or depends on a technology for which nobody has a root. The archive problem has demonstrated answers in inscribed glass and institutionalized copying. The genetic problem has a demonstrated answer in stored gametes. The governance problem has a demonstrated answer in ritual and in physical constraint. The competence problem has a partial answer in simulation and redundancy. The meaning problem has the oldest answers of all. The obstacles are mass, cost, and the willingness to make a 2,000-year promise. Those are political and economic obstacles, not physical ones, and that is a genuinely different kind of difficulty. Physical impossibility closes a question. Expense merely postpones it. There is a second counterweight, gentler than the first, and it belongs here too. 2,000 years is long by the standard of institutions and short by the standard of a species. Agriculture is roughly 10,000 years old. Writing is roughly 5,000. Continuous cultural transmission across 2 millennia has already happened on Earth, repeatedly, in languages, in religions, in crafts, in bloodlines, in recipes. Never on purpose. Never with a deadline. Never inside a sealed volume with a finite oxygen supply. But the span itself is not unprecedented, and it is worth saying plainly, humans have held things for that long before. They simply did not know they were doing it, and nobody asked them to. That is the difference the ship introduces. Not the duration, but the intention. 2,000 years of accidental continuity is ordinary. 2,000 years of deliberate continuity, held against a written target by people who know they are holding it, has never been attempted. It is worth being precise about which parts have actually been demonstrated and which have only been argued, because the two get blurred in a list this long. Sealed ecological systems have been built and run, and they have failed instructively rather than fatally, which is the most useful kind of failure. Long-duration confinement has been studied, and the results were better than expected on average and more variable than expected between individuals. Very long-lived archival media exist and are in use. Genetic material has been stored and successfully used after decades. Institutions have transmitted practice across 2 millennia, repeatedly. What has never been demonstrated is any of it at the same time, in the same place, for the same duration, without an outside. Every component of the answer has a track record. The assembly has none, and there is no way to acquire one except by doing it. Which leaves a question the engineering cannot reach, and it is the honest place to end the technical half. The ledger establishes that this is possible. It does not establish that it should be attempted, because the fourth failure mode from the opening never goes away. A ship built to the cheapest specification that still arrives is a ship that arrives having spent 2,000 years extracting compliance from people who never agreed to anything. And when the ledger is read as a whole, it keeps arriving at the same answer from 12 different directions, which is the thing worth carrying away from tonight. The consent problem is eased by spare volume and a partition. The governance problem is eased by having somewhere for a faction to go. The justice problem is eased by having room to separate people who cannot be separated. The population problem is eased by a ceiling high enough that nobody has to be told no. The competence problem is eased by carrying more practitioners than the work requires. The meaning problem is eased by space for festivals, for craft, for sport, for a garden that produces nothing but shade. The conflict problem is eased by districts far enough apart to be different and close enough to remain one society. The collapse problem is eased by a lifeboat, and then eased much further by a second hull entirely. Every hard social problem aboard is softened by size, by spare capacity, and by multiplicity. Not one of them is solved by a better engine, which means the answer to tonight's question is quieter and stranger than it first appeared. What it would take for a society to survive on a generation ship is, mostly, for the ship not to be a ship at all. For it to be large enough, redundant enough, and plural enough to stop being a vehicle and start being a small world, with a small world slack in it. The vehicle framing is what generates the coercion, because a vehicle is optimized, and a world is merely inhabited. And so the answer to a governance problem, arriving over and over from every direction the ledger approached it, turns out to be more room. There is something almost restful in that. The hardest question in interstellar travel does not require a breakthrough. It requires generosity, decided in advance, by people who will never see whether it was enough. Not cleverness, not discipline, not a better constitution or a stronger faith or a more ingenious mechanism for holding intent across 70 generations. Just more air than necessary, more space than efficient, more people than the work requires, and more than one of everything that matters. And so the ledger closes where it kept pointing. Not toward a stronger engine or a cleverer law, but toward more room. More air. More spare years. More ways to disagree without anything tearing. Whatever crosses that distance will not be a crew. It will be a small, slow world that never stopped keeping itself, carrying people who lived their whole lives between two places they would never see, and who kept the seals checked anyway. Let your breathing slow. Let the day settle out of your shoulders. Sleep well and good night.